Hello everyone! Today I am going to be showing you how I made this very cool poison area of effect enemy. So essentially in this project we have an enemy which will shoot a projectile at the player and create this poison ring at the player's feet, and after a few seconds, if the player is standing within the radius of the circle, they will begin to take poison tick damage. So let's try building this project from scratch. So here I am in a pretty much fresh Unity project. But before we get started, I'm going to have you do two things. One, if you don't already have a player controller in your project, I'm going to leave a link to download a free player controller from the Unity Asset Store in the description. This controller isn't my favorite, but I'm sure there are better ones out there, and for the purposes of this video, it'll do just fine. So once you have it downloaded, just bring that into your project and set it up like I have here. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a plane and rename it to ground in the inspector. I'm then going to scale it up by 3 just so we have a little more room to run around in the project. Then you're going to go find your player model in the hierarchy and make sure the tag is set to player. If by default it is set to untagged, click the drop down menu and make sure you click player. Then I'm just going to close out some of these settings because I prefer things clean. So once all that is in, I'm just going to do a check and make sure my controller is working. And yes, it all seems to be working fine, so that's great. The second thing I'm going to ask you to do is check out the YouTube video on particles that I have linked in the description. I already set up the particle system that I'm going to use in this project, and I will show you some of the settings here, but if you want to get a better understanding of the particle systems and how to create them yourself, I'd recommend starting there, as that is where I learned how to create the particle system that I'm using in this project. Don't worry about the particle controller script I have attached to this particle at the moment, we're going to get into that later. Alright, with that out of the way, let's create a prefabs folder in order to stay organized, and then right-click in our inspector to create a 3D capsule. This capsule is going to act as our enemy in this project. I'm just going to move it and set it up in front of our player. Okay, now that I have our enemy where I want it, I'm going to create a folder and call it Materials. Then, I'm going to create a new material and call it Enemy. Change the color of this material to red and drag it onto the enemy capsule. Now, our enemy is red, which everyone knows is the universal color of enemies. Let's drag the enemy from the inspector into our folder to make a prefab. Okay, now let's create another folder to hold our scripts. We're going to make 3 new scripts. Name the first one AoE Enemy. We'll call the second one AoE Projectile. And then we're going to make a fairly basic health script. So call this one Player Health. Okay, now I'm not going to go through this code line by line. I'm instead just going to paste it into the project as I already have it written out. However, feel free to pause the video in order to get a better look at the code. If there's any confusion over what the code is doing, I have gone ahead and written comments for almost every line of code to better explain what exactly is happening. Make sure you save all 3 of the scripts, then go back into the Unity editor. Don't worry if you have an error at this point, it probably has to do with that projectile controller script I mentioned earlier. We'll get to that in a minute. Drag the player health script onto your player, and set the max health variable. I'll set it to 500 for now. Now, double-click to open the enemy prefab, and right-click on this icon to set the view to front view so you know which side is the front of your enemy. Then, right-click on the enemy in the inspector to create an empty game object and rename it to shoot point. This will be the point where our enemy projectile is going to spawn at, and where it will look like it is shooting from. Move the shoot point to the desired location. For example, if you want an enemy to shoot poison from its mouth, move this point to the creature's mouth. Once you're happy with the location of the shoot point, click Add Component to add the AoE enemy script onto your enemy prefab. Then, drag the shoot point from the hierarchy into the shoot point location on the script. As you can see, we're still missing our enemy projectile, so let's go ahead and create that. In the hierarchy, create a new sphere and call it Poison Projectile. Reset its transform, and then just like our enemy, let's create a prefab by dragging the projectile into our prefabs folder. I'm going to start by scaling it down. Then, make sure under Sphere Collider you click the Is Trigger box. Next, let's add our AoE projectile script. I'm also going to create a new material and call it Poison Green. I'm then going to set the material color to be green and drag the new material onto our projectile. This next bit is more of an aesthetics choice, but I'm going to add a trail renderer to the project to give it an extra toxic feeling. Click the Add Component button and search for Trail Renderer. You can copy the settings I have here, or try and make your own. All I'm going to do is adjust the width by double-clicking to add a point and dragging it down. And I'm going to change the time variable to 0.2. Then I'm going to change the color settings to this green color, where it fades from a light green to a transparent darker green. I'm going to test it by dragging the prefab around in the scene view, and as you can see, that doesn't look quite right, because I forgot to add a material. So, click the material dropdown and select Particles Unlit. This is a standard asset and should already exist in your project. Let's go ahead and add our poison particle to this projectile prefab now. Go to the prefab of the particle you want to spawn when the projectile hits the ground and drag it into the poison particle slot. Now, let's drag our completed projectile prefab onto our enemy. Alright, let's talk about that particle controller script I mentioned earlier. In my case, I am spawning this ring particle, which shows players the exact radius of the affected area that will damage them when they step within it. In order to do this, I am accessing the particle's radius setting from the inspector, and setting it manually through the script in order to change the particle's radius. I am saving this value as a public float called Poison Radius, which I am able to access from the AoE projectile script in order to set the size of the overlap sphere collider. This is the collider which checks if the player is within the radius of the particle, and by using the same variable value, I ensure that the sphere collider and particle radius are always the same. And that's it! If we click play, our enemy should shoot the projectile at the player, and if you haven't changed any settings, there should be a 2-second delay before our player starts taking any damage when they are within the poison radius. After that, the player should be dealt 5 points of damage every half a second. Of course, feel free to play around with all the values in the inspector until you achieve your desired result. And remember, if you want to change the radius of the poison damage, you can access that from the particle controller script. I'm going to play around with some of the values to show you the different results you can achieve, but I hope this video helped explain this super fun project I made. Of course, if you have any suggestions on how I can improve, feel free to share, as I am always trying to learn. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.